We should say this series is sponsored by the website universaltheosophy.com. And it is being conducted by several associates of the United Lodge of Theosophists. Now, the American Theosophist, William Q. Judge, writing about the greater Theosophical movement, said that wherever thought has struggled to be free, wherever spiritual ideas, as opposed to forms and dogmatism, have been promulgated, there the great movement is to be discerned. And that is certainly an apt description of this constellation of brilliant minds associated with the New England Transcendentalists. They were the Theosophists of their era. And I thought it would be useful to start us off with a brief overview of New England Transcendentalism in general, and what was it, where did it, from what did it arise, and what did they espouse? And in this respect, it's difficult to define it in any sort of precise, definitive manner, because there was no Transcendentalist creed, there was no, there were no articles of faith, there was no one book or prophet that they gathered around. But the philosophy of Transcendentalism did center around some essential concepts. And in his lecture, The Transcendentalists, which he delivered in 1842, Emerson pointed out many of these concepts and traced the term itself back to Immanuel Kant. I wanted to read just a short passage from this. This was a lecture that he gave. What is popularly called transcendentalism among us is idealism. Idealism as it appears in 1842. As thinkers, mankind have ever divided into two sects, materialists and idealists. The first class founding on experience, the second on consciousness. The first class beginning to think from the data of the senses. The second class perceive that the senses are not final and say the senses give us representations of things, but what are the things themselves? They cannot tell. The materialists insist on facts, on history, on the force of circumstances, and the animal wants of man. The idealists on the power of thought and the will and of will, on inspiration, on miracle, on individual culture. And further on, he says this about the term transcendental itself. He says, it is well known to most of my audience that the idealism of the present day acquired the name of transcendental from the use of that term by Immanuel Kant of Königsberg, who replied to the skeptical philosophy of Locke, which insisted that there was nothing in the intellect which was not previously in the experience of the senses, by showing that there was a very important class of ideas or imperative forms which did not come by experience, but through which experience was acquired. That these were intuitions of the mind itself, and he denominated them transcendental forms. The extraordinary profoundness and precision of that man's thinking have given vogue to his nomenclature in Europe and America, to that extent that whatever belongs to the class of intuitive thought is popularly called at the present day transcendental. And in drawing from a book by Harold Goddard, Studies in New England Transcendentalism, I put together a list of some ideas some key ideas that they embraced. And Goddard points out that they all approach these concepts in their own way, of course, some placing more emphasis in one area than another, and they were couched in their own intellectual framework. But in general, that there were these main concepts that sort of run through all of these transcendental thinkers. And these were, first, the unity of the world in God and the immanence of God in the world. And the idea of the soul of each individuality, of each individual, the soul of each individual as identical with the soul of the world. And the prime importance of self-reliance and individualism. And the essential unity of all religions. And a disregard for all external authority and for tradition. And always an underlying everything else was a fundamental belief in the identity of the individual soul with God, and an unshakable faith in the divine authority of the intuitions of the soul. Now, New England Transcendentalism emerged in the 1830s and centered around Boston and Cambridge and Concord, where Emerson and Thoreau had their homes. And it was in some ways kind of a pushing back against the established Unitarian church. Unitarianism had arisen in the 18th century as a more liberal and less dogmatic response to Calvinism. And by the early 19th century had dominated the Harvard Divinity School. Emerson's father was a Unitarian minister, and Emerson himself went to Harvard Divinity School and was a member of the clergy until he resigned in 1832 over some kind of doctrinal disputes. I don't quite remember what they were. But while the Unitarian Church was indeed less dogmatic and more liberal in its views than the stern Calvinism that it displaced, by the 1820s and 1830s, it had, in the views of quite a few people, grown conventional and stale and settled and uninspired and stuck in its ways. And there emerged a man who many consider the first of the Transcendentalists, and he was a Unitarian minister named Ellery Channing. And although he never severed his connection with the church, he was keenly aware of its shortcomings. Emerson referred to him as our bishop. And he wrote this in 1820. I have before told you how much I think Unitarianism has suffered from union with a heart-withering philosophy. I will now add that it has suffered also from a too exclusive application of its advocates to biblical criticism and theological controversy. In other words, from a too partial culture of the mind. I fear that we must look to other schools for the thoughts which will thrill us, which touch the most inward springs and disclose to us the depths of our own souls. And Goddard points out that the typical Unitarian of this time was a man of tolerance, of intellect, of cultured tastes, and unexceptionable private morality and notable civic virtue, as well as many other admirable qualities. But he was not either metaphysical or emotionally spiritual in his temperament. Philosophy and enthusiasm he did not have. Yet philosophy and enthusiasm were exactly the things of which his religion stood most lamentably in need. I was quoting Harold Goddard. And it was indeed this lack of enthusiasm, this lack of philosophy and independent thought that Emerson so famously called out in his address to the Harvard Divinity School in 1836. And it was an address that so offended the Orthodox administration that he was not invited back to speak for over 30 years. Now, the New England Transcendentalist movement is usually thought to have begun with the formation of what became known as the Transcendental Club in Boston, started in 1836. It was an informal gathering of men and women interested in meeting together to discuss the new views in philosophy and theology and literature. And initially the group consisted of Emerson and Bronson Alcott and a few others, and it was later joined by Margaret Fuller and Thoreau and Theodore Parker and Nathaniel Hawthorne and a great many others. And in 1840, a Transcendental magazine was started up, a journal called The Dial, with Margaret Fuller was the editor. And the journal discussed theology and philosophy and contained papers on art and music and literature, and had translations of Oriental scriptures and lots of poetry. And its contributors were Emerson and Fuller and Thoreau and Bronson Alcott and Ellery Channing and Theodore Parker and quite a few others. So the Transcendentalists did indeed look to other schools, as Channing said. Emerson and Thoreau and Fuller and Alcott especially were deep students of Greek philosophy. They studied Plato and the Neoplatonists. And they gave serious attention to Eastern philosophy, including the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita, which had first been translated into English in the last part of the 18th century. And they had a familiarity with the classics of Greece and Rome that was typical of a well-educated person in the 19th century. So we could say then that the New England Transcendentalism was a time of awakening in which the light of the ancient wisdom shone and found a home. I was going to conclude my remarks with a short reading from one of Madame Blavatsky's articles, which he wrote in 1888, concerning the Transcendentalists. She said the American Transcendentalists discovered that life could be made a sublime thing without any assistance from circumstances or outside sources. Of course, this had been discovered many times before, and Emerson only took up again the cry raised by Epictetus. But every man has to discover this fact freshly for himself. And when once he realized it, he knows that he would be a wretch if he did not endeavor to make the possibility a reality in his own life. The Stoic became sublime because he recognized his own absolute responsibility and did not try to evade it. The Transcendentalist was even more, because he had faith in the unknown and untried possibilities which lay within himself. This series is sponsored by the Universal Theosophy website, and it's being conducted by some associates of the United Lodge of Theosophists. And last week's session started off with a kind of a general overview of what the Transcendentalists were and Transcendentalism, what that was, and what some of the key concepts were, and how it emerged in the context of New England society and the culture of the early 19th century. And I thought it might be useful to begin today's discussion with some exploration of one of these concepts encountered throughout the writings of Emerson and others of the Transcendentalists. And the scholar Harold Goddard pointed out in his book on the New England Transcendentalists that the Calvinists believed that human nature was totally depraved. It was kind of a grim theology. They believed in predestination and that most of us were going to roast in hell. The Unitarians came along and sort of softened this up quite a bit and were much more liberal in their views. And they affirmed that human nature is essentially good, and that we all can be redeemed in the eyes of God. The Transcendentalists went even further and proclaimed that human nature is divine. And we need to think about what this means, because it can be kind of an empty abstraction. I mean, it's still very much an abstraction, but maybe we can make it kind of less empty. And to say that all men and women are essentially divine is to affirm the presence within each one of that which is unconditioned and beyond definition, unchanging and universal. And we might call it the self, and not the personality, which is constantly changing, not the body, which is a temporal existence, but what we might think of as the capacity for awareness. It is sometimes referred to as spirit, which is universal and everywhere. And it's the power to become, the power to see, the power to know. And while it is so that for so much of, if not most of our lives, our consciousness is wrapped up and focused on our personal circumstances and the turmoil around us, and we tend to become identified with our personalities and our livelihood and our likes and our dislikes and so forth. And that is not our true self. We are capable of abstracting ourselves from our outer lives, of holding a dialogue within ourselves, of making deliberate choices about what direction we will head and how we will treat others, how we will respond to things. And we can often recognize when we are in the grip of an emotion or have made some horrible mistake, and we can recognize these things. We can choose to alter the course. And this ability we have to have this inner dialogue and so bring about changes in our inner and outer lives, this is a godlike power, and it testifies to the divine presence within us. And to awaken more and more to this universal divine aspect of our being, and to become less entangled with the personal and the separative personality, to get rid of our egoism. We might say that this is to describe what it means to grow and to mature as a human being. And Thoreau put this very well in this beautiful passage from Walden, where he says, we must learn to awaken to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our sound asleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture, or to carve a statue, or so to make a few objects beautiful. But it is far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do. To affect the quality of a day, that is the highest of arts. Every man is tasked to make his life, even in its details, worthy of the contemplation of his most elevated and critical hour. And so the presence of divinity within every human being was an assumption profoundly alive and real to Emerson and to Alcott and to Thoreau. And it is a concept taught from antiquity in Eastern religions and in the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita, and it was taught by Plato and in the Neoplatonists and throughout history and throughout the world. But it was over many centuries largely stifled and made into a heresy by the institution of the Christian church. And so here is Emerson in his address to the Harvard Divinity School in 1838, giving kind of a great big push back. And I want to read these passages because this is kind of a transcendentalist manifesto in a sense. It's a challenge to the establishment, which at that time and place happened to be embodied largely by the Unitarian Church. And he said this, and it's just a few paragraphs from what's a very lengthy address. He says, historical Christianity has fallen into error that corrupts all attempts to communicate religion. As it appears to us, and as it has appeared for ages, it is not the doctrine of the soul, but an exaggeration of the personal, the positive, the ritual. It has dwelt, and it dwells with noxious exaggeration about the person of Jesus. The soul knows no persons. It invites every man to expand to the full circle of the universe, and will have no preferences but those of spontaneous love. But by this Eastern monarchy of a Christianity, which indolence and fear have built, the friend of man is made the enterer of man. The manner in which his name is surrounded with expressions, which were once sallies of admiration and love, but are now petrified into official titles, kills all generous sympathy and liking. All who hear me see that the language that describes Christ to Europe and America is not the style of friendship and enthusiasms to a good and noble heart, but is appropriated and formal. You shall not be a man, even. You shall not own the world. You shall not dare and live after the infinite law that is in you, and in company with the infinite beauty which heaven and earth reflect to you in all lovely forms. But you must subordinate your nature to Christ's nature. You must accept our interpretations and take his portrait as the vulgar draw it. That is always best, which gives me to myself. The sublime is excited in me by the great stoical doctrine, obey thyself. That which shows God in me fortifies me. That's what shows God out of me, makes me a wart and a wen. There is no longer a necessary reason for my being. Already the long shadows of untimely oblivion creep over me, and I shall decease forever. The time is coming when all men will see that the gift of God to the soul is not a vaunting, overpowering, excluding sanctity, but a sweet natural goodness, a goodness like thine and mine, and that so invites thine and mine to be and to grow. So this idea of the divine nature within every human being was foundational to key principles or assumptions that are present in one form or another and throughout the Transcendentalist movement. The unity of the world and God, and the immanence of God in the world, and the soul of each individual as identical with the soul of the world. And we heard much last week about Emerson's concept of the oversoul. And the idea of the prime importance of self-reliance and individualism, and a disregard for all external authority and for tradition. And a fundamental belief in the identity of the individual soul with God and an unshakable faith in the divine authority of the intuitions of the soul. And with respect to intuition, we spoke last week of how the word transcendental comes from Immanuel Kant and indicates that realm of ideas which we call the intuition, that comes to us not so much through rational thought, through comparing and weighing and analyzing and so forth, but it's more the nature of a direct perception. And I think that Thoreau gives us a rather wonderful description of that faculty in this little gem from one of his essays called Walking. And he's talking about knowledge, not as knowledge is information, as facts. And he says, my desire for knowledge is intermittent, but my desire to bathe my head in atmospheres unknown to my feet is perennial and constant. The highest that we can attain to is not knowledge, but sympathy with intelligence. I do not know that this higher knowledge amounts to anything more definite than a novel and grand surprise on a sudden revelation of the insufficiency of all that we called knowledge before. A discovery that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy. It is the lighting up of the mist by the sun. Man cannot know in any higher sense than this, any more than he can look serenely and with impunity in the face of the sun. And I thought this phrase, this sympathy with intelligence, was a wonderful way to think of what is meant by the intuition. And I wanted to reiterate too that the Transcendentalists drew from such a wide array of sources for their inspiration. And it was this opening up to other religions and philosophies, both ancient and modern, that infused so much excitement and enthusiasm and life into the Transcendentalist movement. And Harold Goddard describes Transcendentalism as being kind of a renaissance. And he says this, which I thought was a useful thought. He says, finding many of the same ideas in men, finding many of the same ideas in men separated by the widest distances in time and space. Orientals, Plato, Jesus, Plotinus, Spinoza, Kant, Goethe, Coleridge. These Transcendentalists became imbued with a feeling of the identity rather than the diversity of the great thought of the world, with the belief that all religions are aspects of one religion, all philosophies of one philosophy. And Emerson wrote this in the Dial journal. He said, the more liberal thought of intelligent persons acquires a new name in each period or community. And in ours, by no very good luck, it sometimes appears to us, has been designated as Transcendentalism. We have every day occasion to remark its perfect identity under whatever new phraseology or applications to new facts, with the liberal thought of all men of religious and contemplative habit in other times and countries. So, as the Transcendental movement began to emerge in the 1820s and 30s, Emerson was more or less at the center of things. And as the ideas were being increasingly discussed, many young and searching minds were drawn into his orbit. And one such individual was Margaret Fuller. She was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1810, which made her about 7 years younger than Emerson and about 7 years older than Thoreau. Her father undertook her education, and it was an extensive education and almost unbelievable. She was studying Latin at the age of 6. She later went to some finishing schools for women. And the extent of and the range of her reading and of her intellectual brilliance and her drive to just devour all aspects of learning was just astounding, really. And just to give a kind of a flavor of what her life was like during this early period when she was being educated, there's a kind of a wonderful description she gives here. This is from a letter that she wrote to one of her former teachers about what her life was like at the time. This is written in 1825. She said, I rise a little before 5. I walk for an hour, and then I practice on the piano until 7. Then we have breakfast. Next, I read French, Sismondi's Literature of the South of Europe, until 8 o'clock. Then 2 or 3 lectures in Brown's philosophy. About 9:30, I go to Mr. Perkins' school and study Greek until 12. When, the school being dismissed, I recite, go home, and practice again until dinner at 2. Sometimes, if the conversation is very agreeable, I lounge for half an hour over the dessert, though rarely so lavish of time. Then, when I can, I read 2 hours in Italian, but I am often interrupted. She continues with this account of the rest of her day, and she concludes, thus you see, I am learning Greek and making acquaintance with metaphysics and French and Italian literature. Well, she wrote this in 1825. Good heavens, she was 15 years old. I mean, can you imagine? So, as a result of these pursuits, she became probably the most highly educated woman in the country by the time she was in her early 20s. And she had learned German. She fell in love with Goethe and made several translations of his works. She had a great veneration for Coleridge. She studied Rousseau. I mean, just go on and on. And she was drawn to Emerson early on, and through his lectures and his sermons. And it's a kind of an interesting bit. It's a letter that she wrote to someone. This was before she had actually gotten to know him. And she says, you question me as to the nature of the benefits conferred upon me by Mr. E's preaching. I answer that his influence has been more beneficial to me than that of any American, and that from him I first learned what is meant by an inward life. Many other springs have since fed the stream of living waters, but he first opened the fountain. That the mind is its own place was a dead phrase to me, till he cast light upon my mind. Several of his sermons stand apart in memory, like landmarks of my spiritual history. It would take a volume to tell what this one influence did for me. But perhaps I shall sometime see that it was best for me to be forced to help myself. So in these years, the 1830s and 40s, she attended meetings of the Transcendental Club. She became friends with Emerson. She spent a lot of time visiting his household. It might be fair to say that her role among the Transcendentalists at that time was largely an educational one. She went to work for Bronson Alcott, helping with the school that he had established. And she held what came to be called her conversations, which were sessions or kind of discussion groups that she conducted primarily for educating women of all ages. Emerson's wife, Lydian, would occasionally attend them. And it's apparent that she was motivated in large part by a desire to share her knowledge with others. In a preface to a book she wrote called Papers on Literature and Art, she wrote this. She said, "It has been one great object of my life to introduce here the works of those great geniuses, the flower and fruit of a higher state of development, which might give the young who are soon to constitute the state a higher standard in thought and action than would be demanded of them by their own time. I feel with satisfaction that I have done a good deal to extend the influence of the great minds of Germany and Italy among my compatriots." And one little quote that's kind of, it's been attributed to her, says, if you have knowledge, let others light their candles at it. I was going to read a little description by Emerson, which I think he wrote in a book that was published about Margaret Fuller after her death. Talking about their time together in Concord, and she visited him fairly often there. And he says she had so many tasks of her own that she was a very easy guest to entertain, and she could be left to herself day after day without apology. According to our usual habit, we seldom met in the forenoon. After dinner, which meant about 1 o'clock, we read something together, or walked, or rode. In the evening, she came to the library, and many a conversation was held there, whose details, if they could be preserved, would justify all encomiums. They interested me in every manner: talent, memory, wit, stern introspection, poetic play, religion, the finest personal feeling, the aspects of the future. Each followed each in full activity, and left me, I remember, enriched and sometimes astonished by the gifts of my guest. Her topics were numerous, but the cardinal points of poetry, love, and religion were never far off. Now, she and Bronson Alcott came up with the idea for a Transcendentalist journal, which was started in 1840. And Alcott named it The Dial, suggesting a sundial which tracks the sun. The journal discussed theology and philosophy and contained papers on art and music and literature and translations of Oriental scriptures and poetry. Its contributors were included Emerson and Margaret Fuller and Thoreau and Alcott and Ellery Channing, Theodore Parker, among many others. And Emerson took over as editor after 2 years, and the magazine folded after another 2 years, and it just total it lasted about 4 years. It folded because it just ran out of money and didn't have enough readers to support it. Her life took a very new direction in 1844, and she was hired by Horace Greeley as a literary critic for the Tribune, and she moved to New York. And around this time, what's probably her best known book was published. That was Woman in the 19th Century. And during the next couple of years, she wrote about numerous reform movements, including the abolition of slavery, prison reform, women's rights, and lots of stuff on arts and literature. And then she was sent by the paper to Europe in 1846 and became their first female correspondent.